Joe, let me ask you this. Start with an easy question. A hot topic today is this new trade bill with our Pacific partners, and that's raised a lot. The president is all in favor of it, and so are the Republicans. And the opposition comes from people in his own party, and I suspect people like you. What's the matter with it?
You're right that I think it's a bad bill. First, you have to understand this is not about trade. One of the basic things about Washington is that when you see a bill with a name on it, it's probably the opposite of what it says. So if it says free trade, it's about managed trade. And this is not even, the real controversy is not really about trade. In recent years, globalization, expansion of trade has actually not been good for ordinary workers. It has contributed, we have now strong research people at MIT and elsewhere, that in those parts of the country where there have been, producing goods that are competitive with the goods that are being imported, say from China, unemployment is higher and wages are lower. The market isn't able, especially in a period of downturn, to adjust to create the new jobs as the old jobs get destroyed from imports. But this bill is not basically about jobs. It's about two things: undermining regulations that protect our health, our environment, worker safety, every regulation. And secondly, it's about intellectual property and innovation, about access to health, medicines. Can I just spend a minute talking about those two things?
What if I said no?
Well,
you do it anyway. Go ahead.
Okay. So the regulation is a provision called an investment agreement, and it's sold on the idea that it's protecting property rights. Who could be against protecting property rights? Because Apple is an American, pie, apple pie. But the fact is, we are using the same argument in Europe. And when we do that, and we trying to sell Europe on that they need stronger property rights, they scratch their head and they say, we thought we had a good rule of law. We thought we had good property rights. And then they go on to say, and if we don't have good property rights, why should we improve them just for foreign firms? Why not for our own firms? It turns out to be worse than that, because when you have a dispute, the dispute is adjudicated not by courts, not by a judicial system of the 20th century or 21st century, where you have openness, precedence, appellate, a whole kind of thing that we develop a legal system over the last several hundred years. This is done by private arbitration, well-paid lawyers, making a lot of money out of this. And the result of this is really a system gone awry. Well, the United States is now engaged in the 21st century opium war. You didn't probably know this. It's a quiet war, it's a trade war, but under these provisions in these investment agreement, under these provisions, Philip Morris is suing Uruguay and Australia for regulations that are the same as we have here in New York City. Packaging, telling customers when they buy cigarettes, it may not be so good for your health. Philip Morris says that those warnings are discouraging sales and therefore hurting its profits. Yes, that was the whole intent of the warnings, to try to make people informed consumers and say, maybe you don't want to die, maybe you shouldn't be smoking. Well, if Philip Morris wins, it means that they won't be able to regulate their product to protect their citizens. But exactly the same thing can happen here in America. If we discover something else is dangerous, if we want to protect the environment, any foreign firm can now come to the United States and say, I'm sorry, what you're doing is taking away my profits, and you have to compensate me for not destroying the environment, for not hurting your health. Now, some of you look puzzled because this can't be the case. The answer is, I find it actually startling, but it's actually true.
But Joe, why is the president so adamant in supporting it?
Well, I'm not a psychologist, so I'm not going to tell you what's going on in his mind, but I think I have some understanding of political strategy. The fact is the president is having a very hard time getting anything through Congress, and Congress is really trying to block everything. So he finally found something that he can get through Congress, but precisely because he can get it through Congress, you should be worried. And so this is something that a lot of Republicans like. They represent the corporate interests. They see it's their profit, their company's profits are going up, so that's why they like it. They don't care. They've been trying to strip away environmental regulations and health regulation. In fact, when I was in the Clinton administration, we had a fight over exactly the same issue. The name of the legal issue, for those who are lawyers, is called regulatory takings. And that you have to compensate somebody when you pass a regulation. And the courts have said you don't have to. It's against the way we do things. Congress rejected it when it was actually put up to a vote on this particular issue. What they're trying to do is hide this in a trade agreement, get something they couldn't get if we had an open national debate about the issue.
But Joe, you were as you said, you were in the Clinton administration, and the president then was a big supporter of NAFTA. And remember that it was, what's his name, who said it would be a great big sucking sound.
Ross Perot.
Ross Perot, and would cost jobs. Now, in retrospect, was NAFTA good or bad?
It was not a big deal, either way. And the point is that Mexico did get sued under this provision. One of the interesting things, the USTR at the time was Mickey Kantor, and he is sort of emblematic, a very nice guy, and I like him a lot, but how did he get the position? He was President Clinton's campaign manager. And USTR is one of the ways you pay back those who've made contributions. So I had an occasion to ask him at one point, as it became clearer what was going on, were you aware of what was in NAFTA? And his answer was no. That it was basically, another example, it was a trade agreement that had been done under Bush, hadn't been finished under Bush. And so he just said, what we were going to do is to try to put what they call sidebars on making, environment and on labor standards. And what we now know is didn't make much of a difference. Really didn't improve labor standards. Didn't have much effect on environmental standards. So, this goes back to the point that I was making. Tariffs between the United States and Mexico were already very low, 5%, 3%. Not, getting them to zero makes a little difference, but not a big deal of difference. But these things make a big deal of difference. And there was a little town in Mexico where there was a toxic waste dump in the middle of the city. And the town said, we don't like toxic waste dumps in the middle of the city. And they passed a law saying you can't have a toxic waste dump in the middle of the city. And they were sued, and the taxpayers, Mexican taxpayers, had to compensate, to pay the guy not to have a toxic waste dump in the middle of the city. So that's what we would be exposing ourselves. And things have gotten much, much worse since then, because firms like Philip Morris have learned how to use these provisions. And so the skill in using these provisions to sue, to get money, has just soared. So the number of suits going on are increasing. It is a real threat. Now, can I link this back to the question of inequality, which is the subject, in a way, it's linked in a couple ways to the subject that I talk about in the book. One part that I mention is the very high legal fees. Access to justice is a part of inequality. One of the problems in the United States is that I don't know if you remember when you were a kid, you say, I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United, and one of the provisions at the end is with liberty and justice for all. But we have developed a very expensive legal system. And so now what we should be saying when they say the Pledge of Allegiance to, with justice, not for all, but for all who can afford it. And we saw that very clearly in the mortgage crisis. People were thrown out of their homes. Even when they didn't owe money, the banks lied to the courts, said that we've looked over the records and they owe money. They didn't. But these poor people couldn't afford the lawyers to defend themselves. And the remarkable thing, even though the banks lied hundreds and thousands of times, not a single person was held accountable. Not a single person was held accountable.
Well, one of the points you make in the book is that the banks were bailed out, but homeowners weren't. We just alluded to. And this continued, so let's say this started in the Bush administration, and the Bush administration was more favorable to corporate interests than to ordinary people, but certainly the Obama administration should have done the opposite, and it did not. Why?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think that links with a major theme I try to bring out. United States is now the country in the world, among the advanced countries, with the highest level of inequality and among the lowest levels of equality of opportunity. And that means the life prospects of young American are more dependent on the income and education of his parents than in other advanced countries. We used to think about the American dream and how, but the American dream is a myth. But whenever you have...
Now or in the past?
Now.
Now.
It used to be a lot of truth to it, but now we are actually less of American dream than other countries. There are more other countries that are more of the American living life, more like the American dream that we used to have than we did, than we do now. But the point I was going to make was that whenever you have that level of economic inequality, it inevitably translates into political inequality. The last election cost $1 billion for each candidate. And when you have to raise that money, they call it contributions. But for most of our corporations, they're not contributions in the charitable sense of contributions. They're better likened to investments. And in fact, the bank's investments in politics paid off a lot better than their investments in mortgage markets and in other things. They're actually the highest paid return in their investments. They didn't know how to manage real assets, but they did know how to manage their political assets. So that's really what's going on. And it's gotten worse with decisions like Citizens United that have given unbridled access to money that has meant that American democracy is becoming more and more better described as $1 one vote rather than one person one vote.
Well, in the book, and in your earlier book, The Price of Inequality, you argue that there is a nexus between politics and economics, and it gets translated into political inequality as well as economic inequality. Could you expand on that?
Yeah, well, let me try to expand why this is so important, because a lot of people think that the inequality is just the result of market forces. And, demand and supply, returns to some factors go up and others go down, and it's just the workings out of the market. But those market forces are everywhere. They're in all the advanced countries. They're very similar. Why is it? Why is it that we have more inequality than any of the other countries? Why is it that we have less equality of opportunity? And that comes down to politics and policies. That we, in a way, made a choice. When we say our choice, our political system has made choices and has made choices about particular rules, regulations, the way we're now discussing the trade agreements. It will mean that access to medicine will actually go down, prices will go up, even in the United States, let alone in other countries. And that means poor people will have a harder time, especially in those states where the states have rejected the expansion of Medicaid under Obamacare. So it's the politics that structures our economy, and it's the structures of our economy that lead to all this inequality.